Hi everyone, today let's talk about Terraform versus Ansible. Now, in some of our videos past, we've talked about Terraform in detail, Ansible, and even infrastructure as code, but I think a lot of you might be wondering when to use Terraform and when to use Ansible, and in my view, these are actually two very complementary tools, so I believe you can use them together when you're doing kind of your infrastructure automation. Now, I think the first thing people think about when they think about infrastructure automation is actually the step of provisioning, right? So how do we actually get something up and running so that we can actually start, doing our application development and that kind of thing? And that's one thing Terraform is really good at. And one of the reasons it's so good at it is because Terraform is declarative in nature. And this is actually one of the key differences between Terraform and Ansible, but we'll get to that in a minute. So let's see what a kind of a Terraform configuration would look like. So we want to provision some resources, let's say on a public cloud. We're going to do so in a declarative way. So we'll start by saying maybe we want a database service. So we'll say create DB, and it'll have some configuration to go with it, like what kind of class it is and what size, that kind of thing. Maybe we also want to create a Kubernetes cluster and maybe even some VMs in a VPC. So we'll first create the VPC and maybe some more configuration to create the VMs. So we'll kind of have our Terraform config there. Now, I mentioned it's declarative, and this is awesome because, in these steps over here, we've created some DB services and some other things. So let's say we want to actually bind that database service to our Kubernetes cluster. So in this step right here, we'll say bind to Kubernetes. Now, in a procedural language, everything would go top to bottom. So it would start with the DB and realize, hey, I can't bind it to something that doesn't exist. But since Terraform is declarative, it'll actually say, okay, we can't do this one yet. Let's create the Kubernetes cluster first, also create the VPC cluster kind of simultaneously, and then once that's ready, then we'll create the database because it's dependent on the Kubernetes cluster to bind to. This is essentially what's called an implicit dependency. You can also do explicit dependencies where you can just tell a resource to wait until another one is up and ready to go. So that's one of the key advantages of Terraform is that it takes kind of a declarative approach. So we've talked about Terraform. Let's kind of switch gears here a little bit and talk about what Ansible is really good at. And now, Ansible's main kind of purpose, in my opinion, is configuration management. This includes things like application deployment, but it can actually also do infrastructure provisioning. Now, one of the key things I'll say about Ansible is that it's not necessarily declarative, but it supports declarative resources, and it's not necessarily procedural either. It's kind of, let's call it a hybrid. Now, in this sense, I basically mean that, Ansible supports, much like Terraform, kind of configuration files to do your automation. So, for example, configuration management tasks can be something like, first you would start up a VM, maybe it was stopped, maybe you need to restart it or stop it or something like that, and some configuration, so just telling it, just to start up. Then maybe you install some application into the VM and some drivers, maybe you need to install the runtimes. And so you kind of have some configuration steps. Maybe you utilize the open source community where they've built modules and collections of these things that allow you to get started quickly. And then maybe finally you start the actual application. So these are all config management tasks, application deployment. You're working with resources that are already created. Now, the reason I say it's hybrid is because although the resources are written kind of in a declarative fashion, they're actually executed top to bottom. So this is an Ansible playbook, and Ansible would first start with the VM creation and then installing the app and then starting the app. So if you had these in the wrong order, things wouldn't work correctly. So that's my view. That's why I think Ansible is declarative and procedural in a sense. It's kind of a hybrid of both, depending on how your modules are written. So we've got our infrastructure, we've got our kind of configuration. Now let's talk about going back to Terraform, what it looks like to actually start executing this configuration. So first thing we'll do is, generally you want to do something called a Terraform plan, which will enable you to see what will actually come up before you actually execute the real API calls. So we'll do a Terraform plan, and it'll spin up some of this, a view of what's going to actually get created. So the database, the cluster, the VPC, and when it all looks good, you'll do a Terraform apply. That'll use your API key and run the actual API calls against your cloud provider, using your API key, and spin up all of that infrastructure. And this is what Terraform is really good at. And this brings me to my third thing about Terraform, is that it's very much managed on state for lifecycle management. So one of the really cool things here is, for example, once you've created this infrastructure, if you go back and remove an entire piece of config, for example, the create VPC block, if you remove that and you run a Terraform apply again, it'll actually remember from last time. It'll say, hey, last time you had this, now you removed it, and it'll go ahead and remove that VPC for you. Now, the difference with Ansible is that there is no kind of lifecycle management. No, now, essentially what this means is that if you wanted to delete some step of this flow, you can't just remove it. You would need to kind of mark it for deletion, so you would need to kind of do a remove app step. Now, that doesn't go to say that you couldn't necessarily create an Ansible playbook that automatically recognizes when you remove some configuration and run the steps. The point is, with Terraform, you get it automatically, and with Ansible, you kind of have to implement that lifecycle management into your actual code. Another key point I want to make here is idempotency. So that's essentially the ability to run something multiple times, and if nothing has changed, it won't actually run anything, run any new actions. So with Terraform, you get that automatically. So you can run this 1,000 times, and the first time it'll create everything, and the remaining 999 times, it would actually just say, hey, you already have it, nothing's changed, and it wouldn't do anything. Now with Ansible, you could technically create idempotent modules, but it's not a requirement. So that's something that you as a developer have to consider when using Ansible is, see the community modules you're using, the cloud provider modules and collections you're using, and make sure they're idempotent. And if they're not, you might have to do some additional work to get them going. Now, I think I've made a case for both capabilities here, but I want to talk a little bit about the similarities between the two as well. For one, they both support heavy templating. So this is great. So you can have kind of one source of truth and then different configuration files. So for example, if you wanted a dev and a test and a prod environment, you can have one source of truth and then kind of just switch out the variables that you're using to spin up the different environments. So that's something neat that both environments support. Number two, they're both open source, as I mentioned. But the key thing I want to mention is that they've got a big kind of community as well. So for Terraform, they have the Terraform registry with modules being developed and providers to work with the cloud providers. And so they've got this rich community to help you get started very quickly. And Ansible's the same. They've got Ansible Galaxy with collections of modules so you can get started very quickly with existing playbooks and that kind of thing. So they're similar in that sense that they've got this big kind of community. And the last thing I'll say is agentless, which is kind of more relevant in the Ansible context than Terraform, since it's doing configuration management. You don't have to install an agent on a VM somewhere. Both of these tools are kind of plug and play, easy to get started, whether on your local machine or somewhere in the cloud. These tools are both very similar in that they're easy and quick to get started with. Now, you might be wondering, in the beginning I said these tools are complementary. So how would you use Ansible and Terraform together? Well, there's a couple of approaches. You could start with Terraform. Now, as I mentioned, Terraform is really good at provisioning. So you could have a Terraform configuration that spins up some infrastructure, and then once that infrastructure is ready, you can actually use Terraform to call Ansible to do configuration management on the resources you spun up. So starting the VM and installing an app and that kind of thing. You could also take the other approach and start with Ansible. And in the first step of your Ansible playbook, call Terraform to spin up infrastructure, and then pick up where Terraform leaves off, take that infrastructure, which is in some inventory, an Ansible inventory, and run the Ansible actions on that. So in essence, Ansible and Terraform can work really well together because Terraform is very good at infrastructure provisioning, but falls short where Ansible comes in with configuration management. And I think together, both open source, world-class infrastructure automation tools, I think together you can really create a complete infrastructure automation story. I want to thank you for joining me for this video today. If you want to see what IBM Cloud is doing in the infrastructure automation space, be sure to check out IBM Cloud schematics. If you have any questions or you like the video, be sure to drop a comment below and a like. Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more videos like this in the future. Thank you.